you how funny life is. When I began the chase for my next guest, who I'll introduce momentarily, I was 18 at the time, 5 years ago. 5 years later, I'm 23, got a job, got a car, got a driver's license. So that's how long this chase has been going on for, through a pandemic, everything. And finally, today he's here. I'd like to thank John Miller for helping me get this next guest, and I'd like to thank former NYPD Chief of Department Lou Anamone for helping me get this next guest. We got to move quickly because he's a busy man. He hasn't stopped. We got until 2:30, so we'll make it count. And my next guest is a man with a lengthy resume in the world of law enforcement, a native of Boston, or at least in the Massachusetts area, greater Boston area. Excuse me. His career in public service spanned nearly 5 decades and saw him oversee police forces in Boston as well as Los Angeles and New York City. After almost 20 years in Beantown, he came up to the Big Apple, I should say, for the first time in 1990 to run the New York City Transit Police, which at the time was separate from the NYPD. Later returned in 1994 to become the city's 38th NYPD Police Commissioner. After he left in 1996, he went into the private sector, came back into policing in 2002 as chief of the LAPD, which he ran until 2009, and returned one more time as NYPD Commissioner, the 42nd, in 2014, and he ran the department once more until he left in 2016. These days, he's back in the private sector with Teneo, and that is Mr. Bill Bratton, who joins me now, finally, after 5 years on the Mike the Able podcast. Commissioner, welcome. How are you?
All good things are worth waiting for.
I would say so. So, like I said, native of Boston, specifically the Dorchester area. Tell me about growing up, and when did you first know you wanted to be a cop?
Boston is a city of neighborhoods, and I grew up in the Dorchester neighborhood. St. Peter's Parish, you identify by parish. In Boston, New York, they identify by school. And born and raised Boston, joined the Boston Police Department in 1970. Grew up in what would be described as a poor neighborhood, Coldwater Flat. Dad was a postal worker, worked 2 jobs, actually. My education was all public schools. The Mathis School, Edward Southford Elementary School, first elementary school in Boston many years ago. My college education was provided by the federal government as a scholarship program in the 70s, just as I was joining the Boston Police Department. As I came into Boston Police in 1970, it was a time of extraordinary turmoil in our country. The anti-war movement was in full swing, the Vietnam War. We had just had the horrific assassination of Robert Kennedy, assassination of Martin Luther King, the various riots that ensued, the Democratic National Convention catastrophe in Chicago. And in Boston, during the 70s, we had 2 of the largest desegregation efforts in the country up until that time, the desegregation of Boston public schools and its public housing. So my first 10 years in policing were amplified, if you will, by all the societal issues that were underway at that time. And in 1980, I became superintendent of the Boston Police Department, the highest ranking uniformed officer. I had a relatively meteoric rise in that department.
I would say.
And it's a time of great learning for me, a time of great understanding of the police profession and the fact that it was not a profession. It didn't have any of the credentials that a profession would normally have. It did not have a strong history. It was criminal justice programs were just beginning to be taught in various colleges and universities. And it was a brutal profession. It was a racist profession in many areas. And it was a corrupt profession in many cities around the country.
Yeah, it was a very chaotic time, as you said, and that's where the efforts to kind of spearhead the movement to clean it up and bring pride back to the uniform came into effect. Now, your ascent continued. You ran other agencies in the Boston area. You had some experience with transit in Boston and police agencies there, which brings us into 1990 and your arrival to New York. Now, Boston is no small city. But, you know, each big city has its own distinctive personality. Boston has theirs, for example. Los Angeles has theirs, and New York certainly has theirs. And you're coming into a situation in 90 where 3 separate agencies. New York City Housing Police handles all the housing projects. That's a city in and of itself. It's 2 million people across the housing projects in the 5 boroughs. The Transit Police at the time, also separate from the NYPD until the merger of 1995, they're handling 4 million people at that time taking the subway every single day. And the year you took over was the infamous Brian Watkins murder. And that's when the New York Post came out with the cover, Dave, do something. And Dave tried his best to do something, but you also decided you wanted to do something too. So taking over the Transit Police at a time in which morale was low, The subways were particularly violent. This is not too far removed from Bernard Goetz and that whole controversy. Tell me about the game plan you put into effect to bring not only crime down, but morale back and pride back to that particular agency.
The reasons for coming to New York in 1990 from Boston, where I had been in the Boston Police Department, then, as you referenced, ran the MBTA, the 70-person Transit Police Department, and then the Metropolitan District Commission Police, a 600-person highway, forest, beach patrol organization. Transit Police was 3,800 police officers patrolling the subways principally, something like the 12th or 13th largest police department in the country at that time. So it's an opportunity to take over a major department, even though its focus was on transit. It was in the largest city in America. And I took on that challenge because that department was failing. Crime was going through the roof. Disorder on the subways was, I think, even worse than what was going on the streets at that time. And it was an extraordinary challenge, but the old adage, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Well, if you could make it in the New York City subways, you could make it anywhere. And I specifically came to New York encouraged by two mentors, George Kelling, the co-author of Broken Windows, and Bob Wasserman, a colleague, mentor for 50 years, with the inducement that if you get the subway straightened out in New York City, you might have a shot at becoming an outside shot at becoming New York City Police Commissioner. The idea of somebody from Boston, New York City Commissioner, kind of far-fetched back in 1990, but I've always been a bit of a dreamer. And so I came to New York with that intention. Fortunately, the systems we put into place that were successful. We got quality of life dramatically under control very quickly. Fare evasion, 5,000 homeless that were occupying the subways, the robberies, the track fires. And it was noticed by the public because every day, as you mentioned, 4 million New Yorkers got on and off that system. And even as the streets upstairs did not seem to get better, down below, it was noticeably different. So it was noticed by, in particular, Rudy Giuliani, who was now running for mayor once again after having lost to David Dinkins. And Giuliani approached me to apply for the position. I did apply. I was accepted by his nominating committee and came to New York. And the rest is history in some respects, that, if you will. I'm very proud of the accomplishments that I and my team. I always work with a team. I might be a very good leader, but a leader without a team is basically a leader without a team. And I had every place I've worked, whether it was transit, New York, I've always been able to assemble a great team. Jim Collins, who writes the great management books, has an expression: get the right people on the bus, get the wrong people off the bus, and get the right people in the right seats, and get them all working on spinning that flywheel. Flywheel takes a lot of energy and momentum to get it going, but once it gets going, it moves much more smoothly. But to do it, you have to have a team. And that's what I had in the transit system. That's what I had certainly in New York. We have many of the names, the legendary Jack Maple, yes. Louis Anamone, who you referenced in your run-up as my chief of patrol and chief of department, John Timoney, John Miller, all legendary names in American policing. In some respects, it was kind of, I describe it as the Camelot of American policing in that period of time in New York City.
It was. Lenny Levitt was a friend of mine, and I miss him a lot. He passed away a few years ago. And
he was a pain in the neck during our time.
Jack Maple.
We used to hang out with Lenny up at Elaine's. He'd be up there late in the evening with us.
Yeah, I've heard. And Jack Maple, funny story that Lenny told me a number of years ago when I had him on. They ran into each other at one police plaza, and Jack Maple says to Lenny, "How are your 3 readers?" And Lenny says, "They're good, but keep in mind, it's your boss. 2 of those readers are your boss, Bill Bratton, and his boss, Rudy Giuliani." And they shared a good laugh, so they were able to tease each other like
very
that.
Appropriate, but short. Very
yes. But I remember a column, because his archive is still up, and it came out in 1997, referencing exactly what you just said, that time in New York City policing was truly Camelot. And I think what was interesting during that time, too, is you come into it in 1994 as the NYPD commissioner. You were already familiar with New York. And of course, during your time running the transit police, I should say. And then in the spring of 1995 comes that merger. Now, this is an interesting thing that not a lot of people, I feel, ask you about. April, transit comes over. You absorb everything, and not just their patrol personnel. The emergency medical rescue unit is absorbed into emergency service. A month later, the entire housing police comes over too. So you're getting a groundswell of personnel, but now you're trying to augment things and get them to understand that, okay, how you did things in the transit police or how you did things in the housing police is going to be slightly different than how you're going to do it in the NYPD. So handling such a large acquisition of not just one, but two police departments, how was that for you during that spring and summer of 1995?
It was then and will probably always remain the largest merger in the history of American policing, just the sheer scale of it. 25,000 New York City police officers, almost 4,000 transit officers, close to 3,500, I think, housing police officers, who had all been hired under the same system, who had all been trained at separate academies, but had the same curriculum, basically. And they all policed the same city, although they had specific areas of focus, subways, housing. And the merger was something I initially opposed as chief of transit police, because the NYPD looked down its nose, particularly from the leadership down to the rank and file cop, down the noses at the subway cops, the tunnel rats, and the housing cops. And they just thought them lesser police forces. And you mentioned the idea that I knew something about New York before taking the police commissioner position. Every time before I take over a police department, I basically do my homework. I know what I'm getting into. So the exposure for the 2 years I ran the transit police, I could see we were the underdog working against the big bad wolf across the street, the NYPD, and their incompetencies and their inefficiencies and their disdain for us. And so I came in understanding that. And understanding that helped me to pull off that merger. It was Mayor Giuliani needs to be applauded for it, because other mayors had tried it and never succeeded. He did try it and succeeded. And my role was to try to make it as seamless as possible. And having been chief of the transit police, a popular chief, a successful chief, ironically, my transit cops were not happy to now finally merge with the NYPD, something they had wanted for 25 years, because they felt they were better off after my time with them than joining with the NYPD. But I was able to be sensitive to the blending of the three organizations and their respective strengths. And to this day, it's worked out pretty well, that in terms of that, they are the NYPD with a transit bureau and a housing bureau, but they move personnel between those three entities fairly regularly now.
Yeah, and I have a mini series on this program that focuses on retired members of ESU, and everyone from Housing's Rescue Unit to Transit's Rescue Unit to the ESU have said that merger worked out so well, for example, with that unit alone, because, for example, the guys that were in the Housing Rescue Unit, anytime they had an emergency in the projects, those guys knew the projects like the back of their hand, and anytime there was an emergency in the subways, a man under, train derailment, whatever it was, those guys that were in the Transit Police's Emergency Medical Rescue Unit knew the subways like the back of their hand. So that knowledge blended into one, and that alone was beneficial.
Let me give you an example of that expertise. In the subway, a frequent issue was people being run over by trains, electrocuted on the tracks, being squeezed between a subway car and the platform. Horrific scenes and incidents. In the Transit Police Emergency Service Unit, were equipped and trained through repeated issues in terms of almost 100 people a year were dying in the subway, falling under trains, etc. They had special equipment, airbags, that could literally push a train away from the platform to extricate a person, or lift a train off the tracks to get somebody who was under the train. And to do that with all the electrical issues. So over time, the three merged entities all benefited from the skills that they had acquired separately, but now could work on jointly.
Yes, talking with a former NYPD, LAPD, Boston Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. Finally happy to get him on the show after a 5-year chase. You know, with that being said, before I move forward to the LAPD in 2002, you had dealt with line of duty deaths before, of course, during your time in Boston, but then comes 1994. During your time in transit, no cops were killed in the line of duty in the transit police. But in 1994, you had Sean McDonald get shot and killed. Later that year, Ray Cannon. So that first line of duty death in New York, when you heard Sean was shot, I should say, young father of two, 26 years old, came from a family of cops. Tell me about that process and dealing with that for the first time in the city.
Well, it was not the first time I had dealt with death of officers, had that experience in my
in New York City, I meant,
but not in New York City. The scale of a death of a police officer in New York City is huge. Tens of thousands of officers turning out for the funeral. And in the case of Sean McDonald, killed up in the Bronx on foot patrol, myself, John, Tim, and the others were ironically at some type of premiere that evening in Midtown Manhattan, and we all went rushing up for that. And I write about that in my first book, Turnaround, the experience of helicoptering his wife into the city from out in Long Island. She was a waitress, and being in the emergency room where he had just passed, and everybody's silent as she's walking down the hallway, and remembering the sound of the coins in her waitress apron jingling as she was walking down or rushing down the corridor to come in and see, unfortunately, her deceased husband. And then the size of the funeral. The New York funerals are unlike any in America, just for the sheer scale of them. But using it as, out of tragedy, out of crises, try to find opportunity. And the opportunity that both myself and I think Giuliani attempted to use during that time. Did we lose the connection?
No, I'm here.
Okay, great. All right. I'm sorry. We lost briefly the video connection. Your viewers don't have it, but the radio connection they have. That use that as an opportunity to bring the officers together around the grief, around the tragedy. But we also used it as the opportunity to rally those troops, to rally the city, that this is exactly what we were up against, a city where police officers were being murdered in the streets of New York. And if a police officer on patrol in uniform was not safe, well, who was? And so that tragic death and the others that followed during my couple of years in the NYPD, at the funerals, the eulogies, we use those to effectively bring the cops and the public together around the understanding that public safety is a joint venture. It's not just the cops. It requires the public. It requires the political support. Something we don't have today. One of the things that's missing dramatically in American policing today is lack of political support from both the Republican and Democratic parties on a lot of these issues. But we had it back then, and we were able to utilize it.
And that brings us to 2002. Now, this is an interesting point, not just in Los Angeles' history, but it's also in America's history, because when you take over the LAPD, this is not that far removed from the Rampart scandal, not that far removed from Rodney King. The 90s had not been kind to the LAPD. And in 2002, what's everybody worried about? Terrorism. This is a year after 9/11 and the devastation that we saw in New York unfold with the World Trade Center, and in Washington, too, with the attack on the Pentagon. So not only do you have crime, general crime to worry about, you also have counterterrorism to add to your plate now, too. So taking over LA in 2002 with that, I imagine, two-pronged approach that you had to adapt now. Tell me about trying to, as we talked about earlier, how each big city has a different flavor to it. Tell me about trying to get that groundswell back and that support back from the public for the LAPD after such a trying time in the 90s for them.
It was a multifaceted effort. That the point about 2001 terrorism, well, most of its history, American policing had dealt with crime and disorder. Some issues around terrorism, particularly during World War I. But by and large, didn't touch on most police departments. After 9/11, every police department in America was concerned with the issue and sought to basically expand its capabilities. Going into the LAPD, then the third largest department in the second largest city, they had a very small entity that was focused on terrorism and was largely working on a federal task force. And meanwhile, Ray Kelly was beefing up the NYPD to eventually almost 1,000 officers and additional numbers of civilians on its effort. Understandably, it had been the principal target back in 95, and then again, back in 93, and then on 9/11. But in the LAPD, it required, in a very small police force, just about 9,000 officers. LA was thought to be one of the premier potential targets, as referenced in a lot of the counterterrorism threats that were being made. I had the good fortune of being able to recruit my good friend and colleague, John Miller, who had been a deputy commissioner with me in 1994 in the NYPD. After he left in 1994, John spent a lot of his effort, time, and energy focused on the growth of terrorism. And in fact, had one of the few interviews with Osama bin Laden up in the mountains of Afghanistan, when effectively in John's interview, he declared war on the United States. And what happened shortly after that, we had a growing number of attacks on U.S. embassies, warships, and 9/11. So John, who was much criticized upon his appointment as chief of counterterrorism for the LAPD, because he's this newspaper guy from New York, John was then and still remains probably one of the foremost experts in America, if not the world, on the issues of terrorism. And John was able to create for me, the LAPD, an extraordinary counterterrorism capability that in overall percentage rivaled that of the numbers in the NYPD. And at the same time, we were making a concerted effort to win back the trust of the public in a very racially scarred city whose police department had literally been at war with its Black community for 50 years. And we did that by going after gangs, overall crime, and disorder. And the disorder in LA was phenomenal down in Skid Row. The homeless issues we have today were mirrored by, were forecast by the issues back in 2002 and 2003. So we had a multi-pronged effort to respond to the public's concerns and priorities. I'm a strong community policing advocate, probably one of its chief proponents and practitioners. And community policing has three elements to it: partnership, problem solving, prevention. Partnership with the community, partnership with all the other agencies you need to work with, force multipliers. Problem solving, what does the public want you to focus on? Well, in 2002 in LA, they wanted to focus on gang violence, on terrorism, and on the homeless issues. And so that's what we prioritized. And lastly, prevention. Instead of just measuring our success after the fact, after the murder had been committed, after the gang violence, after the terrorist bombing, what could we prevent? And we could prevent a lot of it if we had public support. And that's what we were able to do in LA, so that by the time I left 7 years later, the largest consent decree in the history of America was then and still is, was implemented successfully. And when I left, the public approval of the department was even in the minority community up in the 60s to 70 percentile. And cops themselves, we had stopped the loss of officers who had been leaving by the hundreds. And we finally grew the department to almost 10,000, the highest number they'd ever had. Unfortunately, that department is now back into the 8,000s once again.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you said. And that was, like you said, the longest of any of the positions that you held. I believe that was the longest.
I have a hard time holding jobs, but this time I got along very well with the two mayors I worked for. In '94 with Giuliani, we had a really rough and long patch of butting heads.
Yeah, well, as we talked about earlier, right? That's what Lenny used to write about back in the day. I have a few more minutes with you, so I want to make them count, and I appreciate your time. For those of you that will watch this on Monday on YouTube, we don't have the video connection. You can see me. You can't quite see the commissioner. He's frozen, but you can hear him just fine. So pardon me for that. But, you know, they say the older you get, the wiser you get, right? By the time you get back in 2014, you had done consulting work on the side. Obviously, you had the experience in LA. And the New York City that you returned to in 2014, dramatically different than the one that you originally came to in 1990 as transit chief and later on as NYPD commissioner in 1994. Ray Kelly, and he certainly has his fans and he certainly has his critics, you know, he did a great job in those 11, 12 years that he was at the helm. Crime kept going down. He implemented, as you said, the counterterrorism program. So you have a great situation thanks to the great job he and his team did, but you can always make a great situation even better. And your approach at that time was, I thought, more community policing, more interaction with those areas that previously there might not have been interactions with. And you left again in 2016, but in those 2 years there, I felt that you kept the ball rolling. And that was the key, right? Once you came back with John Miller once again, keep the ball rolling, keep the good momentum going.
Well, I use the comparison to the flywheel. In the early 90s, we got the flywheel going. We reversed almost 20 years of crime increase, starting in the subway and in the city when Ray Kelly was commissioner in 92, 93. Crime went down in the city each of those years, but by 2%, 3%. It wasn't until we came in 94 and started getting it down by 10 or 15%. So that when I came back in 2014, crime had been going down every year for 24 straight years under a succession of commissioners and mayors. And the public had gotten used to it. We were expecting it. But in the meantime, what had happened was that Bloomberg, in the midst of financial crises, reduced the size of the force so that the 6,000 officers that Dinkins had hired, that Giuliani and I were able to use so effectively in a different way than Kelly had been using it before me, Ray was now basically working with 6,000 fewer officers. And even though crime was down, he had the terrorism threat that was consuming the efforts of over 1,000 officers full-time and many others part-time. But there was also a growing controversy that some of the tactics and strategies that had been so effective in the 90s were now being overused from the perspective of the minority public. And specifically, I'm talking about stop, question, and frisk, which was controversial through much of Bloomberg and Kelly's time, that a well-intended effort on their part to make up for a much smaller police force by having a much more active or assertive police force. Unfortunately, they were using their newest recruits, the newest hires in the toughest neighborhoods of the city to try and accomplish that. And the new kids were not particularly well trained or versed or supervised on how to do stop, question, and frisk appropriately. And the public, particularly the minority public, ultimately the press, and every mayoral candidate that ran for office in 2013 were highlighting that it had to change. Kelly himself and Bloomberg effectively had begun to change it around 2011 or 12, so it was down from a peak of about 700,000 documented stops to, I think, when we come in, it was down to fewer than 100,000. But I had not campaigned with de Blasio, but encouraged de Blasio that if I put in as police commissioner again, I could do the continuation of the crime decline with many fewer stops, because I felt that they really weren't necessary any longer. That stop, question, frisk is essential, but it's like a doctor applying chemo to a patient. As the cancer retreats or declines, you give less chemo. Unfortunately, what the department had been doing is crime and disorder were declining. They were applying more chemo, more stops, more questions, more frisks, ostensibly to get guns off the street, but gun violence had been going down dramatically all during that time also. So in any event, I come back in 2014, and what I've always felt very good about, if you think of it, in 2002, I'm hired in LA after 6 years in the civilian sector. But my reputation from the 90s basically had stood the test of time. And then de Blasio hires me in 2014, although I'd been out of policing once again for now almost 5 years. So again, I felt very good about the idea that I had stood the test of time and was successful in my comeback in New York in 2014, in that crime went down very dramatically, stops went down. But then we had several tragedies that created problems for us during that time. One was the death of Eric Garner in Staten Island, the chokehold death. And the other was the murder of our two police officers, Ramos and Lou, just before Christmas, and that awful tragedy. And plus the cops literally turning their backs on Mayor de Blasio. The cops hated de Blasio, the union in particular. And so I had to deal with that constant grievance, constantly being publicly expressed. But the good news was that I was able to pretty much designate my successor, who I had basically trained for that position, Jimmy O'Neill. His successor is also able to play a role in his designation, Dermot Shea. Dermot had a little rougher time as commissioner because he was dealing with a mayor who had increasingly grown out of public favor and media favor, and also dealing with coronavirus and a very unhappy workforce over some of the issues. So after I left in 2016, for I think the last time, I don't think you'll see me back in New York as commissioner again. That
never say never.
Crime. Well, that's what they say, but I'll tell you now, it's never. That crime continued to go down, so that 2018 was the safest year in the modern history of the city of New York. You'd have to go back. Actually, you go back all the way to when they actually started keeping records that you could think was somewhat accurate back in the 50s or 60s. And I'm talking about accuracy around the issues of murders, for example. That in shootings, we really didn't start categorizing shootings as a separate category until the 1990s when we brought Compstat into the city. But a record year, 2018, with two successes to me, playing a role in keeping the city safe and also implementing a citywide neighborhood community-oriented police reorganization of the department.
All of which was incredibly effective, and all of which is still a tactical blueprint that many are trying to follow, not just in New York, but
I predicted for 25 years very comfortably that crime would never go back up in New York because we had learned how to deal with it. We had Compstat, we had enough cops, we had political will. What I had not taken into account was a crazy city council and a crazy assembly in Albany. And between the two of them and their criminal justice reform efforts, well-intended, but a lot of what they were trying to correct was always already being corrected. They wanted to reduce the jail population at Rikers. We had reduced it from 22,000 a day down to about 8,000 or 9,000 by the time I came back in 2014. State prison population was down by over 40%. They wanted to reduce the numbers of arrests. They wanted to reduce the number of summonses, all of which had been done, and we were implementing community policing. So they were attempting to fix something that was already fixed. And why? Because they didn't understand their history. They were so wrapped up in their political ideology, this idea of, move as much away from arrest as you can. I'm sorry, there's bad people in the city of New York, and they need to be arrested. They need to be incarcerated. Did we need to arrest or incarcerate as many in 2018 as in 1994? No. Why? Because there was so much less crime. And that's the reality of it. There were many fewer people in jail. There were so many fewer people in prison. And all of that hard work of 25 years was overlooked, and they screwed it up to a fairly well. We're still feeling the impact of that well-intended but incredibly flawed criminal justice reform effort.
This is the last question because I know I got to let you go soon. It kind of, what you just said plays perfectly into it. You recently wrote The Profession, not that long ago, one of your latest books. Is it everything from the last few years that prompted you to write that book, or were you already thinking about putting those thoughts into, written form?
Actually, I have two previous books. Turnaround, when I left the NYPD, that was out in 97, 98. I thought my police career was over in 96 after Giuliani and I parted ways. And here I was, the commissioner of the largest police department in America, one of the most respected in the world, and going into the private sector. And so I wrote a book figuring that was going to be my book, my take on American policing. A few years later, after the LAPD, which thankfully I didn't recognize in 96, 97, I still had another 25 years to go. That second book was Collaborator Perish, also with a co-author, a management book, basically, about how to manage not only police organizations, but management in general, lessons learned over the years. The third book, a memoir, I was not enthusiastic about doing, but my co-author in the first book, Peter Nobler, the publisher, Random House, an agent, David Black, and my wife, Ricky, were all pushing me, no, you have another book you need to do. Not a biography, but a memoir. And for your listeners, my interpretation, biography versus memoir, you think it's the same thing, but really isn't. Biography is my personal story, a lot more about my personal growth in policing. The memoir is the story of many people I met along the way and how they impacted on me and what I thought about things and how I changed my mind and philosophy along the way. And so the memoir, as I put my arms around it, made sense. The book came out in hardcover in 2020, but it was before the January 6 riots. And while it was selling well, the publisher of Random House came back and said, we're willing to put out a paperback with an epilogue. How often do you get a chance to, in a sense, do an epilogue, that things that you missed? And I feel very strongly about the events of January 6th, that American police saved American democracy on that day from the demagogues that were going to take it away. And that, so Peter Noble and I went back to the drawing board and put together, I think, a very eloquent epilogue in the paperback edition of the book. Also has a much better looking cover. The cover is one that I designed, and it basically shows all of my police badges through those almost 50 years. So it's more noticeable on the book stands. But in any event, that the memoir is history through my eyes and the experiences of many people I met along the way of those 50 years and how the profession had progressed. It had become a profession. It is now taught in many universities. There is now significant bodies of research in terms of what works, what doesn't work. Its leadership, I think I was part of the greatest generation of American police leaders in the 80s and 90s. We now have a new generation wrestling with the phenomenal problems of policing in the 21st century. And so the book is intended to reinforce that policing is always about a journey. We never arrive at a destination and stop. We're always going to have to keep evolving. We thought we had crime and disorder under control in the mid-1990s, and we did. But then 9/11 occurred, and we had to refocus on how to deal with terrorism. 2013, 14, we had to start refocusing on ISIS growing out of Al-Qaeda. And then in our own country, we had to deal with the threats of domestic terrorism that exploded on January 6th. So that domestic terrorism is now the principal concern, and foreign terrorism, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, have moved off to a lesser priority. And the world of technology, who would have envisioned in the 1990s the technology, the crime that comes out of technology, ransomware, hacking, all the human trafficking issues that are supported by it. No, it's a extraordinary profession that's constantly growing, evolving. I feel fortunate to have helped to shape it for 50 years. And I think the foundations we created, that if you know your history, you'll understand that those foundations are still very strong. But like anything, you have to keep working to preserve it. And it's the challenge for police leaders now going forward. How do you preserve an institution that is so essential to protecting our democracy? And that was so evident on January 6th. We almost lost our country on that day, except for the heroism of the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police, and then the federal agencies that finally stepped in to help. We came that close, and that's my perspective as I've left the profession, and now just comment on it.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your time. Again, the time just flew by, and thanks once again to Lou Anamone and John Miller, two mutual friends of ours who've both been on my program previously, for getting this to happen. Of course, your book is The Profession. I'll link it when I put together the description of this episode. It's something that I definitely want to get my hands on soon. So thank you very much, Commissioner. I know you got to go. Just stick around briefly. We'll say goodbye off the air, and I'll leave you be. Thanks, everyone. That will see this episode Monday. And on behalf of former LAPD, Boston, and NYPD Commissioner William Bratton, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care.